Welcome to Washington Today for Monday, June 19th, 2023. I'm Gary Starkoff. Thanks a lot for joining us today. Secretary of State Antony Blinken wrapped up his China trip today, and he says he and Chinese President Xi Jinping talked about a number of sensitive topics in their meeting. That included China's relationship with Russia and North Korea, as well as its aggressive military stance in the South China Sea. Secretary Blinken spoke with reporters following the meeting. We'll hear what he had to say coming up. Congress returns this week. It's their last week of work before the 4th of July holiday. On Thursday, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi will address a joint meeting in the House chamber. And today is Juneteenth, the newest federal holiday. It marks the day in 1865 when the last enslaved African Americans learned that they were free. In 2021, President Biden signed a bill passed by Congress making June 19th a federal holiday. We'll hear what he and other officials are saying and doing today to mark the occasion. We start in Beijing, where Antony Blinken became the first U.S. Secretary of State to visit China in nearly 5 years, and the highest-level Biden administration official to visit there. Here he is talking to reporters following his meeting with President Xi Jinping at the U.S. Embassy.
I raised U.S. concerns, shared by a growing number of countries, about the PRC's provocative actions in the Taiwan Strait, as well as in the South and East China Seas. On Taiwan, I reiterated the long-standing U.S. One China policy. That policy has not changed. It's guided by the Taiwan Relations Act, the 3 joint communiques, the 6 assurances. We do not support Taiwan independence. We remain opposed to any unilateral changes to the status quo by either side. We continue to expect the peaceful resolution of cross-strait differences. We remain committed to meeting our responsibilities under the Taiwan Relations Act, including making sure that Taiwan has the ability to defend itself. We also spoke about a range of bilateral issues, including continuing to develop principles to guide our relationship, as discussed by President Biden and President Xi in Bali late last year. We exchanged views on our respective economic policies, including our concerns about China's unfair treatment of U.S. companies. During my meeting today with U.S. business leaders who are operating in China, I heard about the problems that U.S. businesses are facing, including recent punitive actions against American firms. I also heard that U.S. companies want to continue and indeed grow their businesses here. And so, in my meetings, I sought to clarify any misperceptions or misunderstandings about our approach. There is a profound difference for the United States and for many other countries between de-risking and decoupling. Our countries traded more over the last year, in fact, more than ever over the last year, nearly $700 billion. Healthy and robust economic engagement benefits both the United States and China. And as Secretary Yellen testified before Congress last week, it would be, as she put it, disastrous for us to decouple and stop all trade and investment with China. We are for de-risking and diversifying. That means investing in our own capacities and in secure, resilient supply chains, pushing for level playing fields for our workers and our companies, defending against harmful trade practices, and protecting our critical technologies so that they aren't used against us. I made clear that we'll continue to take targeted actions that are necessary to protect U.S. national security. In my meetings, I also discussed human rights. The United States and the international community remain deeply concerned about PRC human rights violations, including in Xinjiang, in Tibet, in Hong Kong. I also specifically raised wrongfully detained U.S. citizens and those facing exit bans. There is no higher priority for me than the safety and well-being of U.S. citizens overseas, and I'll continue to work intensively to secure their release and their safe return home. As we work to address our differences, the United States is prepared to cooperate with China in areas where we have mutual interests, including climate, macroeconomic stability, public health, food security, counter-narcotics.
Secretary Blinken's meeting with President Xi was not originally on his agenda. It came together following a long meeting with Chinese Communist Party foreign affairs official Wang Yi. Secretary Blinken said that while he and Xi Jinping agreed on the importance of a more stable U.S.-China relationship, the Chinese president said no to restarting military communications between the two nations due to continued U.S. sanctions. Here's more from today's press conference.
China has accused the U.S. of economic containment over the Biden administration's efforts to limit Beijing's access to key technology, including semiconductors, as you mentioned. Are you worried that the future U.S. moves in that area will derail the current efforts to stabilize ties with China and might force the Chinese to take retaliatory measures, perhaps in other areas of the relationship? And after your talks here in China, secondly, what's your impression of the top leadership's stance on Ukraine, whether they are still likely to provide eventually lethal aid to Russia, or are they at all interested in using their influence with Vladimir Putin to bring about a diplomatic solution to the conflict? Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ian. So on the first part of the question, one of the important things for me to do on this trip was to disabuse our Chinese hosts of the notion that we are seeking to economically contain them. We're not. And as I've said, we are not about decoupling. We're about de-risking and diversifying. And here's what I mean by that. First, when it comes to decoupling or economic containment, I think the facts simply belie that proposition. As I mentioned, our trade relationship reached the highest number that it's ever hit last year, about $700 billion in trade. American foreign direct investment in China has reached levels that we haven't seen since 2014. Parenthetically, we've got about 300,000 Chinese students studying in the United States. We have many American companies that I met with, or at least their representatives here, including the Chamber of Commerce, that continue to be very interested to do business here, and it's profoundly in our interest. I also noted to our hosts that China's broad economic success is also in our interest. We have done a remarkable job rebounding from COVID and having a growing economy, very low unemployment, tremendous investments in our future. But we also benefit tremendously when there is growth and progress in other countries, especially one of the world's largest economies when it comes to China. So it simply would not be in our interest to seek to decouple. And as I mentioned, and as you heard Secretary Yellen to Congress just a few days ago, in fact, it would be disastrous. However, what is clearly in our interest is making sure that certain specific technologies that China may be using to, for example, advance its very opaque nuclear weapons program, to build hypersonic missiles, to use technology that may have repressive purposes. It's not in our interest to provide that technology to China. And I've also made that very clear. So the actions that we're taking, that we've already taken, and that we'll continue to take, are narrowly focused, carefully tailored to advance and protect our national security. And I think that's a very important distinction. Now, we're also not the only ones doing that. In fact, the phrase of the day, de-risk, not decouple, was actually put forward by the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen. And it reflects very well the approach that many countries are taking, both because of the importance of sustaining economic relations, trade and investment with China, but also because of concerns about some of the things that China is doing with the technology that's getting to them. So I spent some time making sure that we were very clear about what we're doing as well as what we're not doing. With regard to lethal aid to Russia for use in Ukraine, we and other countries have received assurances from China that it is not and will not provide lethal assistance to Russia for use in Ukraine. We appreciate that, and we have not seen any that contradicts that. What we do have ongoing concerns about, though, are Chinese firms, companies, that may be providing technology that Russia can use to advance its aggression in Ukraine. The Chinese government to be very vigilant about that.
And Reuters reporting a statement from Wang Yi earlier today that said in part, quote, "A choice needs to be made between dialogue and confrontation and cooperation and conflict. On the Taiwan question, China has no room for compromise or concession." Here's more from Secretary Blinken.
How was Taiwan discussed in your 35-minute meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping? U.S. officials have said a military conflict in the Taiwan Strait will be, quote, a global concern. We'll have a presidential election in 2024. Should a democratic election be a pretext to any military escalation in the Taiwan Strait? How do you respond to China's position that Taiwan is an internal issue that is not an American concern, and upon which there is no room for compromise? Thank you. 谢谢.
Thank you. From the very beginning of our normalization of relations with China, going back to the 3 communiques many years ago, fundamental to us in that is the understanding that any differences regarding Taiwan will be resolved peacefully. That is foundational to how we understand our relationship. And for the past almost 5 decades, this is an issue that China and the United States have managed responsibly. We remain committed to our One China policy with the 3 communiques, the Taiwan Relations Act, the 6 assurances. We do not support Taiwan's independence. We've made clear that we oppose any unilateral changes to the status quo by either side. We've been clear and consistent in our policy, and it's very important that we preserve the status quo that has helped maintain peace and stability across the Strait for decades. So I reiterated that to our Chinese counterparts. President Biden has also made that repeatedly clear in his engagements with China. At the same time, we and many others have deep concerns about some of the provocative actions that China's taken in recent years, going back to 2016. And the reason that this is a concern for so many countries, not just the United States, is that were there to be a crisis over Taiwan, the likelihood is that that would produce an economic crisis that could affect quite literally the entire world. 50% of commercial container traffic goes through the Taiwan Strait every day. 70% of semiconductors are manufactured on Taiwan. If, as a result of a crisis, that was taken offline, it would have dramatic consequences for virtually every country around the world, which is, again, why there's been rising concern about some of the provocative actions that China's taken. I also made that very clear. President Biden believes strongly that one of the successful aspects of our relationship with China going back 5 decades has been the responsible management of the Taiwan question. We continue to believe that that's essential.
Secretary of State Antony Blinken speaking at the U.S. Embassy in Beijing. NBC News writing today that today's meeting could pave the way for a summit between President Biden and President Xi later this year. The two last met on the sidelines of the G20 summit in Bali, Indonesia in November. And reaction to the trip from Congress. Here's Wisconsin Republican Mike Gallagher, who's chair of the House Select Committee on China Competition, on the Biden administration's strategy.
One thing, our committee, the Select Committee on the CCP, has invited the administration for at least 4 months now to come testify. And if they sincerely believe that this revival of an engagement strategy, which has failed for 20 years, will be successful, or they can tweak it in a way where it can succeed where it's failed in the past, And they should have that discussion with us in public. Our committee's been very bipartisan thus far. We want to have a meaningful conversation about the best grand strategy vis-a-vis China over the long term. But thus far, they haven't taken us up on that invitation. Again, the risk here is that all of this engagement push means that we don't do certain common sense things like preventing TikTok from becoming the dominant media platform in America, outlawing CCP land purchases near American military bases, stopping the funding of our own destruction by putting guardrails on outbound investment from America into China, and as you mentioned, full transparency into COVID origins and the spy balloon. The American public deserves that. They deserve more than what we've gotten thus far.
In the time we have left, Congressman, quickly, why is it an either or? Why can't you have that defensive posture and put some of those things into place at the same time engaging? And I guess while we're at it, why has engagement, in your estimation, for 20 years been such a failure?
Because it's based on a naive assumption that somehow economic integration would change the nature of how the CCP operates. But when filtered through the ideology of a Marxist-Leninist regime, our olive branch just becomes an invitation to aggression. It shouldn't be an either or, and the risk is not talking per se. As I say, it is shelving actions in order to talk, and that's just what we've done. That's the pattern here, the history. And China has learned over the decades that Americans are highly susceptible to making concessions in their pursuit of diplomacy. Ultimately, any diplomacy needs to be backed by a credible military deterrent. That gives our diplomacy the best chance to succeed, and that's where we're simply not moving fast enough. That's surging hard power west of the international date line in the Indo-Pacific, so Xi Jinping understands he cannot take Taiwan by force.
And also talking today about the trip, House Foreign Affairs Chair Michael McCaul.
Well, I think diplomacy is important, but if you're going to sit down from strength and not from weakness. You need to have leverage in these talks to achieve something. What they did before this meeting, they made concessions on export controls and removing sanctions on human rights violations just to get
for China.
For China.
And they're torturing Uyghurs.
Just to get in the room to talk to them.
So that's not leverage. What would have been?
What would have been would be to condemn the spy balloon very strongly. After the spy balloon took all the pictures of our nuclear sites and B-52 sites, shipping them back to Beijing, we condemned it in the House. This administration needs to be stronger with them. Also, this surveillance program in Cuba is very disturbing if they can pick up signal intelligence from D.C. Not to mention the aggression against Taiwan. I was in Taiwan 2 months ago. Mm-hmm. They surrounded the island with battleships, 70 fighter jets in the air, and then censured me on my way out. They're getting extremely aggressive. So I think we do need to sit down and talk to them, but do it out of strength like Reagan talked about, not out of weakness, and have some leverage going into the talks.
Can I ask you about how it works? So they stopped taking our calls from the highest levels of our government. And then finally, our Secretary of State is on the ground inside China. And after he meets with other people and they report back, I would imagine it must have been pretty neutral, if not positive. Then President Xi says he'll sit down. Is that how it normally works?
No, it's very odd. And as I understand it, he was not treated very well with respect as the top diplomat from the United States. The red carpet was not rolled out for him, this last-minute meeting with Chairman Xi. I'm glad he had an opportunity to talk to him. But, I listen to what Chairman Xi says to the People's Congress, and it's very stark. He made it very clear in this meeting that reunification of Taiwan is not going to go away. He's not going to budge on that.
House Foreign Affairs Committee Chair Michael McCaul, and before him, House Select Committee on China Competition Mike Gallagher, both speaking on Fox News earlier today. And on that issue of military communication between the U.S. and China, and when there could possibly be another high-level meeting between the two nations, here's White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre.
Karine, do you have a sense of, just more broadly on this whole idea of military to military communications, what it is that is the obstacle there? Is it just the idea of sanctions on that defense official in China, or what's in the way here?
So I know the Secretary spoke to this in his press briefing, so I would refer you to his comments. He kind of laid that out since he did have a direct, and as I just stated, constructive conversation with the president and also the other leaders in the country. So I'll just leave it there. But look, we've been very clear. Diplomacy. This president, this administration has been very clear how diplomacy is part of really dealing with what's important to the American interest, and also finding a way to work together. And so that's what you saw Secretary Blinken do today. That's what you've seen this administration do throughout these last 2 years. I'm not going to get into any specifics on any other issues. I will just point you to the readout.
Is there any updates on when the president could actually meet with President Xi or have a call anytime soon?
So I don't have anything to read out at this time. So the president's looking to do that sometimes down the road. I just don't have anything specific or any timeline to zero in on for you all today.
White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre speaking to reporters aboard Air Force One. You can see all of Secretary Blinken's press conference on the C-SPAN Now app and at cspan.org. You're listening to Washington Today.
You can now find all of C-SPAN's nonfiction-focused podcasts in one place, the C-SPAN Bookshelf feed. Follow now, and you'll get all of C-SPAN's podcasts that are nonfiction book-related every week. I'm Shannon.
And I'm Rachel. And as part of the podcast team here at C-SPAN, we wanted to make it easy for our nonfiction book lovers to access all of our offerings in one place.
Hear from authors like Kadada Williams on her book, I Saw Death Coming, Joan Biskupic and her latest, 9 Black Robes, or Neil King, who shared his walking journey from D.C. to New York City in his book, American Ramble.
Featured programs will include Book Notes Plus, Q&A, Afterwards, and About Books. You can follow the C-SPAN Bookshelf feed wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back to Washington Today. Congress returns this week for legislative business and votes. It'll be their last week of work before the 4th of July holiday. The House gavels back in on Tuesday at noon Eastern. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi will address a joint meeting of Congress in the House chamber on Thursday. Lawmakers will also vote this week to attempt to override President Biden's veto of legislation blocking his federal student loan debt forgiveness program. And the Senate is back in session on Tuesday at 3 p.m. Eastern. Senators will also hold a veto override vote on legislation repealing the EPA's rule on emission standards for heavy-duty trucks. You can see full coverage of Congress always available on the C-SPAN Now app and at cspan.org. President Biden was in Northern California today to announce more than $600 million in federal money for projects to help adapt to climate change. He toured the Lucy Evans Balin's Nature Interpretive Center and Preserve in Palo Alto. California Governor Gavin Newsom and Democratic Representative Anna Eshoo joined him. Here's part of the president's comments.
You know, I've toured many sites across the country that clearly show climate change is a genuine, is the existential threat to humanity. The existential threat to humanity. Here in California, the governor, you and I stood together with first responders near Monterey Bay after touring the damage that was done. The devastating storms caused historic flooding that killed 21 people. That comes on the heels of the worst droughts in California in more than a millennia, and the highest sea level rise in more than a century. I've seen wildfire devastation across the West, burning more acres to the ground than are square miles in the state of Maryland. That's how much got burned to the ground, and all the just flying over it is devastating. There's been historic tornadoes and flooding in the Midwest and the Southeast. And just last week across the East Coast and Midwest, we saw what you've already seen here in California. Millions of Americans sheltering indoors. The air not safe to breathe, orange haze covering the sky. It's incredible. By the way, to address those wildfire smoke that's coming from Canada, we're sharing cutting-edge technology that's already used here in California to help detect early fires and help them in sending, in addition to that, firefighters and tankers as well. Folks, the impacts we're seeing in climate change are only going to get more frequent and more ferocious and more costly. Last year alone, natural disasters in America caused $165 billion in damage. Just last year alone. $165 billion in damage. But the worsening impacts are not inevitable.
You can see the whole event at cspan.org. The president is scheduled to attend 2 campaign fundraisers later tonight, both in the Bay Area. Over on the Republican side of Campaign 2024, Michael Haley, the husband of presidential candidate Nikki Haley, was deployed on Saturday on a year-long mission in Africa. Michael Haley holds the rank of Major in the South Carolina National Guard. He will be serving as a staff officer with the 218th Maneuver Enhancement Brigade, which the National Guard says is providing support in the Horn of Africa. That region is facing the worst drought in 40 years, according to the UN, with more than 43 million people in need of assistance in Somalia, Ethiopia, and Kenya, and more than half of those lacking access to sufficient food. Nikki Haley held a campaign event in Berkeley County, South Carolina today. One of the issues she talked about, immigration.
And let me tell you about the border. I didn't just go to the border, see it, and leave. I went 400 miles down that border. You are not ready for what I saw. Mounds of clothing, mounds of shoes, paraphernalia, rape areas where women and girls have to go through. When you get up in the morning, you get your coffee and you watch the news. When these ranchers get up in the morning, they get their coffee and they go see if anyone died trying to cross the fence. They pick up whatever little kids were left behind and turn them over to Border Patrol. I met with multiple sheriffs. They said before 7 a.m., they round up whatever illegal immigrants they can get. They turn them over to Border Patrol. Border Patrol documents them and releases them until their court date years from now. And when I asked Border Patrol about their job, they said, you know what we're doing? We're glorified babysitters. They don't let us do our job. 5 million illegal immigrants have crossed the border. We've had enough fentanyl cross the border that would kill every single American last year. Number one cause of death of adults 18 to 49, fentanyl. And don't think for a second China doesn't know exactly what they're doing when they send it over. Then you look at our national security situation. Did you ever think we'd look at the sky and see a Chinese spy balloon looking back at us? It was a total embarrassment. You've got Russia invading Ukraine. You've got North Korea testing ballistic missiles. You've got Iran building a bomb. But make no mistake, none of that would have happened had we not had that debacle in Afghanistan.
Republican presidential candidate Nikki Haley speaking at a campaign event in her home state of South Carolina, where one of the first presidential primary elections is scheduled for next year. You can see all of our campaign 2024 coverage on our app, C-SPAN Now, and at cspan.org. Back here in Washington, activists and advocates came together for the Poor People's Campaign Moral Action Poverty Congress. The 3-day event brings together people from 30 states to discuss action to combat poverty and hunger in America. Kicking off the event was Reverend William Barber. He's the founding director of the Center for Public Theology and Public Policy at Yale Divinity School and co-chairs the Poor People's Campaign.
We have to have at least a movement, a moral movement in every moment in history that connects the dots and the injustices and recognizes that you don't have to put racism over here and classism over here and ecological devastation over here and all that, because the truth of the matter is, if you die from cancer, you don't die black, you don't die white, you don't die Republican, you don't die Democrat, you die dead. Now that doesn't mean we disrespect this disparity. We do disaggregation of the numbers. Oh, that's important. You have to. We do the percentage disaggregation and the raw number disaggregation. That's why in this movement we can tell you that there are 26 million poor, low-wealth black people. That's 60% of black population. There are 30% of poor, low-wealth white people. That's 66 million white folk. 26 million black, 66 million white. We look at the percentage differences. We look at the impact. But what we also know is if you're poor and you can't pay your light bill, when the lights go off, we all black in the dark. And there has to be a moral fusion movement that says you won't divide us anymore and recognizes that the same forces that attack the LGBTQI community are the same ones attacking voting rights. And the same ones attacking voting rights are attacking health care. And the same ones attacking health care are attacking living wages. And the same ones attacking living wages are blocking fixing the environment. And the same ones blocking fixing the environment are funding the military. And the same ones funding the military in gross ways are oftentimes engaged in religious nationalism. And if they are cynical enough to be together, we have to be smart enough to come together and to stay together. That's what a moral fusion movement does. It's not about being an organization, it's about being an organism.
Reverend William Barber, the founding director at the Center for Public Theology and Public Policy at Yale Divinity School and co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign. This current iteration of the organization started in 2018. It takes its name from the original Poor People's Campaign, which was an economic justice effort organized by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in 1968. You can see the entire event from today at cspan.org. Finally, today marks the Juneteenth holiday, which marks the day in 1865 when the last enslaved African Americans learned that they were free. In 2021, President Biden signed a bill approved by Congress making June 19th a federal holiday. Members of Congress and elected officials have been tweeting about the holiday, including the president. He writes, quote, "Juneteenth is about Americans feeling the progress we can make for America. It's about remembering history, not erasing it. It's about reading books, not banning them. That's what great nations do, and we are a great nation." Republican Governor Greg Abbott of Texas tweeted, quote, "Juneteenth marks the arrival of the Emancipation Proclamation to Texas and the end of slavery in the United States. Texas was the first state to make Juneteenth an official holiday. Today and every day, we strive toward a more perfect union with liberty and opportunity for all." Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer tweeted today also, quote, "I was honored to take the Senate floor on June 15th, 2021, to pass the bill to make Juneteenth a federal holiday at last. We faced down an objection, and I passed it unanimously. It's the first new federal holiday in nearly 4 decades, and it's the only one recognizing slavery's horrors." And South Carolina Senator and 2024 Republican presidential candidate Tim Scott wrote on Twitter, quote, "On Juneteenth, we celebrate freedom for all. Our founders' brilliant framework created an unprecedented pathway for every American, no matter their race, to enjoy life and liberty. 156 years ago started a new day in America as the last enslaved people claimed their rights." And from the C-SPAN video library, here's Maryland Democratic Congressman Kwesi Mfumi on the House floor talking about the bill to make today a federal holiday.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of the Juneteenth National Independence Day Act and to recognize and honor a day that symbolizes freedom for all African ancestred Americans. My thanks to my colleague, Representative Sheila Jackson Lee, for taking the lead on this important legislation and for doing the hard work to put the imprimatur of the United States Congress on this day, a day that means so much to so many. As an original co-sponsor of the legislation, I'm proud to say that once again we are at the doorstep of history, and to finally acknowledge that history in a new light. Juneteenth is a reminder that we must continue to move forward in honor and in recognition of ourselves, our families, our neighbors, and the nameless and faceless generations of African Americans that we will never know. Their plight and this history is all captured in the words of the poet Langston Hughes when he wrote, "I too sing America. I am the darker brother. They send me to the kitchen to eat when company comes, but I laugh and I eat well and I grow strong. Tomorrow I will be at the table when the company comes, and nobody will dare send me to the kitchen then, for they will see how beautiful I am and be ashamed, for I too am America." Madam Speaker, I urge passage of this National Juneteenth Independence Act and encourage all of my colleagues to do the same.
From June 15th, 2021, Maryland Democrat Kwesi Mfumi on the House floor talking about the bill to make Juneteenth a federal holiday. You can find the full floor debate from that day on the C-SPAN video library at cspan.org and on the C-SPAN Now mobile app. That's also where you can find this program as a podcast. You can also get it wherever you get your favorite podcasts. And if you'd like more on the stories that are shaping Washington, subscribe to our evening newsletter, word for word. Just go to cspan.org/connect to subscribe. I'm Gary Starakoff. Happy Juneteenth, and thanks for listening today to Washington Today.
C-SPAN's Washington Journal, our live forum involving you to discuss the latest issues in government, politics, and public policy, from Washington, D.C. to across the country. Coming up Tuesday morning, George Mason University's Jamil Jaffer talks about the federal indictment of former President Trump and the legal issues involving the classified documents of the case. And then Politico national political reporter Sally Goldenberg discusses the week ahead for the 2024 presidential candidates. Also, Lisa Hamilton, president and CEO of the Annie E. Casey Foundation, on how the cost and lack of child care affects families and the economy. C-SPAN's Washington Journal. Join in the conversation live at 7 Eastern Tuesday morning on C-SPAN, C-SPAN Now, or online at cspan.org.